Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Hi, and welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Hema Lomax and Lisa Fine. We are sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights, and we're part of the Compliance Podcast Network. I'm Lisa Fine, and today I'm so excited to talk to my guest, Susan Cooper, who is the Vice President, Regulatory Compliance Programs at Meta, as well as Meta's Global Data Protection Officer. So, Susan, I'm really happy you're here. Thanks so much for joining me. So before we get started in talking about what you do now, can you talk a bit about your background and how you ended up at Meta?
Sure. First, I'll just say thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here too. This is my first podcast and a really great one. So sure, happy to talk about my background. I was an English and communications major in college, and my senior year, like many English and communication majors, I still was not exactly sure what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, but I took a media and the law class. And I became really interested in going to law school and the intersection of copyright, First Amendment, media, law. So I went into law school thinking I would go somewhere in that direction. And then working at a law firm after I graduated, I found my way to privacy. This was a very long time ago. It was the late 1990s. And so privacy was fairly nascent at that point in the US especially. Unlike today, where almost every major law firm has a privacy practice group, there was none of that at most firms. But I found the work was really interesting and I wanted to learn and I need somewhere to learn from. So I left the firm and I took a job as a staff attorney at the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C., because I thought no better place than to learn about privacy than at the FTC. So then it really wasn't until I moved to California that I got introduced to the world of Silicon Valley and tech. And I went in-house and I served as a house counsel for 14 years. And then at that point just became interested in a new challenge. And it was good timing. This was about 4.5 years ago. And as you know, this is right around the time that the regulatory space just became increasingly complex. And lawyers had to really start speaking engineering speak in order to translate the law to product teams. And engineers needed to learn the legal language in order to understand what they needed to do to comply with the law. And the way that Meta was addressing it was basically by putting a regulatory compliance function in its product org. And this just naturally seemed like a really good fit for me and for a next move. So my role over the past 4.5 years since I've been part of Meta's product risk and compliance org has really evolved. And I currently support a few different functions. As you mentioned, our regulatory readiness program team. And my job wearing that hat is to help the company identify new laws, regulatory obligations that apply to the company, and then make sure we understand them and we get them triaged to the right teams to go through a response process. I also support our global privacy and security governance, risk, and compliance team that supports second line oversight for data practices and security compliance oversight. And I have a compliance office. So I personally serve as Meta's global DPO, given my privacy background. And then within my team, there are compliance officers for other major regulations.
And you mentioned this earlier. One of the things I found really interesting when we talked initially and now today, particularly, is that you are in a product function. That's a proactive role. So as opposed to even being considered a regulatory function, you are a regulatory, but subsumed within the larger product. And what do you think makes that unique?
I do think it's unique. I've talked to people at other companies, and I think the organization that we have, and in particular where we sit within the company, is not standard. But I think it's really important because, traditional compliance models can sometimes feel somewhat mismatched for tech companies. That's not to say compliance isn't important, And obviously for Meta, making sure that we are complying with our regulatory obligations is critical. But tech companies move fast and they are encouraged to take risks in the name of innovation. And at its heart, we're a product and engineering company, and we have a product and engineering culture. And so embedding a compliance function within the product org is basically how you embed compliance in the product culture. I like to say that the organization that I work in is a product team, and our product is compliance, basically.
Yeah. I think it also, as you talk about that, it makes a competitive difference, particularly in the technology area in which you're in, because you have to, your risks and have such sensitivity and personal data and information about people that it becomes even more important.
It's exactly right. I think we've learned the hard way that if you are reactive, you're on your back foot, and then you're responding to requirements in real time, and those result in less durable solutions. And you often have to go back and revisit them time and time again. And I think that by being proactive, we're able to better anticipate risks, develop better mitigations, which is better for the company, but it's also better for users. And I think when you have predictable processes, you have a team that is focused 365 on compliance. It helps the company factor the compliance work into their product roadmaps. It helps with prioritization. And then you're right, it allows compliance to be a competitive advantage for the company because we can move quicker. And so we can balance compliance alongside innovation and move equally fast at both.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot in tech space and startups also, it's the move fast and break things and see what happens. And that is sometimes kind of contrary to what you think of from a compliance standpoint, because you like, I don't want to break this because then there will be problems.
Yeah, and I think it's not so much break things, it's more iterate over time. And I think the idea that you have product development cycles where you continue to iterate, and typically when you think about compliance processes, you think about long processes that require multiple layers of approvals that take a long time. And so the idea that you're in an environment and you are designing and building products sometimes in days or weeks, you need to make sure that you're able to match the compliance processes to the velocity of the product development. And it's not to say that that makes for less strong compliance. It's about having a team that can innovate to ensure that compliance is right for a company based on how that company operates.
Yeah, sort of the right-sized compliance, making sure that you're looking at your risks. I talk about it a lot as there's this whole trajectory between so 100% legal that it is impossible from a business standpoint to do all of the things that came in a law from someone who's never actually worked in the reality of it. And then there is the other side, bringing bags of money to meetings is how I talk about it. There's a whole world in the middle that we all need to figure out to kind of move through it.
I agree completely. I also think that in the space in which we operate, the laws often are, the technology is outpacing the laws for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But even beyond that, the types of laws that we're often dealing with are not black and white, right? Like bankruptcy law, where there's very specific things that you have to do. They tend to be principles based or risk based. And they allow a range of responses while still being compliant. And so that can be more tricky and more challenging than if there were a set number of steps that you had to specifically do where the answer was very clear. We often really have to wrestle with novel and complex risks and situations. And that requires a lot of strategic thinking about what the right answer is and balancing the risks and the trade-offs. Because at the end of the day, let's be clear, compliance with the law is absolutely table stakes, But these are still companies, they're still businesses. And so they have to think about risks holistically as well as what the law requires, particularly when there is some room for interpretation. And I think we have established a system and a set of forums that allow us to do that pretty well.
And of course, with Meta, as this is one company that everyone's heard of. So in Facebook and Instagram, unlike sometimes when I talk to people on the podcast, they're in a very niche area. It's fascinating, but I use Meta products. Who doesn't? And you've talked about this, that they're no longer risk management or bit privacy are no longer isolated, but they're core components. You've mentioned that, and product development and business strategy. And with the data risks and that you have so many casual users, people like me, how have you and all in your teams managed to integrate yourselves into these processes as the usage and the organizations continue to grow?
I think the very best thing that we did was create a business organization that includes not only compliance specialists and compliance experts, but also product managers, engineers, product designers, user interface researchers, all in one organization. And so I think often at companies, the compliance team sort of sits in a separate building on a separate campus, and they're really siloed from the rest of the business. And that makes it more challenging for them to integrate with the product teams that they are working to oversee and help ensure are complying. And so our organization in and of itself is, I think, the first thing that we have done. I also think that, talk about meeting the company where we are and making sure that we are operating within the corporate culture. The number one goal is to make it easy for product teams to assess and mitigate risks to their products. And so the organization that I'm part of has designed a risk review process that it runs and that does just that. And the idea is that the product team has a one-stop shop where they can come and they can provide information about the biggest, greatest, latest new product that they want to build. And we can then tell them, hey, here are all of the regulatory requirements that will apply to your product. And let's do a risk assessment and make sure that we are spotting all of the risks and figuring out how to best mitigate them. And we do that all in one place. It's not just privacy. You've probably heard of the concept of privacy by design or baking in privacy versus it being an afterthought. It's very similar to that, but it goes well beyond privacy. And we look at other risks, such as financial risks, content, safety, security risks. So it is multi-domain, and it is the place that product teams at this point in the company know they can't get a product out the door without going through risk review. And we've really worked hard to embed this into the fabric of Meta's culture through top-down messaging, training, and it's definitely gotten to the point where every product team at the company knows that they have to go through risk review before launching their product. And they've come to rely on it because they know that when they do launch their product, it is going to be better, not just because they can feel good about the compliance, but that we're also thinking about risks to people and how to mitigate those. So it becomes a good experience for users too.
I always think it's so interesting when people don't want to work with some of the corporate functions on these things, because I'm like, if you bring it to us, it then becomes our problem for you to make sure that you've gotten through this and to work with you. If you don't understand it, but it really is, once it becomes a part of a process, people get used to it and making things easy. With that, when I was doing my research, which I'm now loving doing with sometimes using AI because I'm so high tech. But can you talk a bit? I was reading a bit about Meta's privacy-aware infrastructure, and then I think you were talking about baked in privacy a few minutes ago, but I understood it as how your code and products have privacy as almost embedded in the actual code or type or whatever it is. So.
First, I will say, having been a lawyer at the company for many years, I think one thing that is particularly unique about the corporate functions, whether it's the legal team or the public policy team, security team at Meta, is that they really do view themselves as part of the cross-functional team that supports the product. So we always call ourselves the XFN. And the idea is that you are an equal stakeholder as other stakeholders. And I think that really creates the right environment and incentives for lawyers to talk to engineers, to talk to other experts and subject matter specialists in a way that helps everybody feel that we're all in this together. We all feel the success of launching the product. And it does, I think, it is very different from a situation where, oh, I have to go talk to compliance. I don't want to. They're going to get in the way. So truly, I think we've worked really hard to make sure that our compliance and second line functions are not viewed as a bottleneck or a roadblock. They are viewed more as support and enablement. And that, I think, it takes a lot to get there. But privacy-aware infrastructure is something that I think is actually pretty cool. We are obviously always thinking about how to mature and scale our program. So to give you a sense of it, over 1,400 products or features go through risk review every month. So that's obviously a huge number, not to mention the fact that for every single product or feature, there is any number of hundreds of laws and regulations that could potentially apply to that product and feature. And they're not always the same, right? So, there's over 100 privacy laws around the world, probably 2 or 3 times that many. And while they all have similarities, they also have unique bespoke requirements too. And so it becomes an enormous challenge, even for a company like Meta that has a large number of employees, to really get their head around the volume of products and laws that need to be assessed. And so what we have done is, using the very same technology that we use to build new products for people, we can use that same technology to make compliance more consistent, scalable, and proactive. And so essentially, we're building innovative products to help us comply better. And that includes privacy-aware infrastructure, which is a way for saying that we embed these requirements directly into pieces of product code that allow teams to reuse high quality solutions to common problems in a repeatable and scalable way. So I'll give you an example. Relates to data deletion. So data deletion is a fundamental right for users. They have the right to delete their data, tell us they don't want us to have their data anymore. And so we can establish a policy or a requirement that says, when requested by a user, data must be deleted within X number of days. And depending upon where that user lives, it might be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, because every law around the world is different. So then what we can do is we can design code that the product teams can implement into their products to make sure that they are meeting the requirements. And so the idea is, you might be Instagram, you might be WhatsApp, you're building different products. You don't have to build deletion code every single time, but you can use the code that has been built centrally and know that now I'm meeting the deletion requirements that apply to my product. And so to ensure that that requirement's working as intended, then we will build a control within our program, and then we will do compliance checks via technical means with human oversight to make sure that that code is working as intended.
So I want to ask, as you've been talking about all of these different areas, I'm going to jump in a little bit of a different topic. One thing that seems great that you all have is lots of engineers, lots of technology, and that's your organization. A lot of the people in this field might not have the same sort of resources and tools. And as we've talked, I think a bit about when you talk about high quality solution to common problems, I think all of us can try to start figuring out solutions. We should be trying to do that in that way. But I was just wondering if, from a practical tip standpoint, when you don't have those resources or you're building your program, What thoughts would you have to help those folks?
It's a really good question. And I think the regulatory landscape is, as we've discussed, becoming more and more complex. And I think it is causing companies to have to think about how to scale to meet all of the obligations in front of them. And I do think that the obvious answer is to scale using technology, using things like AI. And so I think a lot of companies are rethinking their approach to compliance and how they can make it more effective and meet the challenges that we're all facing, regardless of whether our companies are big or small and what kind of resources that we have. We're already starting to see third-party AI-based tools and businesses that are available for companies that can't or don't want to build their own solutions. And so I think those are really good options. But ultimately, what I would say is this can be a strategic investment for any company that will save costs in the long run. And I think, for example, if you are able to use AI, use automation and technology, you can catch issues sooner. You can write reports faster, and then you can action things more quickly. And I think about before we all had laptops, maybe there were typewriters, but before that, we were writing by hand. And think about how long it takes the average person to write a one-page report. Well, of course, a typewriter allows us to write that same report much, much faster. And so, of course, you're still going to need the human resources to proofread. But I do think that the expectation will evolve and that using technology for compliance will become the norm. And so I do think it's something that companies need to think about how they can leverage it given where they are and given the greatest risk that they face too, right? So if you're a company that has a wealth of resources, you might think about scaling technology for compliance across all aspects of your operations. But if you have fewer resources, you can identify the areas of highest risk but greatest benefit when using technology, and you can start by investing in those areas. I do think over time there will be more widely available, cost-effective solutions in this space for sure.
And I don't think it's if we will be using this, it's when and how you use things and how do you learn how to become better with it as a tool that works right for you. Similar to risk assessments, no one size fits all. But it's something you need to be looking at. And I think that it's important. As I've started using it more, it's how do you best use this so that it doesn't make huge mistakes and that you can direct it and use prompts and things. But again, I think that we have to be forward thinking on it. Otherwise, we get left behind.
I think that's right. And we're at a very interesting time in the world where we are living through the introduction of this technology. And obviously, that comes with a lot of fear and concerns because it is not widely understood. And so people are somewhat hesitant because they just don't know how it will affect the broader ecosystem. Could it cause harm? Could it affect jobs? But I do think it's important to think about technology right now as augmenting what we do today and helping us do our jobs better. And that does, of course, mean that jobs will change over time, but ensuring that there is sort of that human oversight to make sure that we're accounting for the unintended outcomes will be critically important for a while.
And I think it also opens up opportunity for people.
Absolutely.
So with that, I wanted to ask, because I'm sure listening to you and what you've done, people are now thinking, okay, this sounds like the coolest job ever, which I'm sure for you some days is more accurate than others, like for everybody. But with that said, for somebody who wants to start out into compliance, privacy, and work in like dynamic technology organizations, what thoughts would you have for that?
Well, the good news is that tech companies are now heavily regulated. So there should be a lot of opportunities for people to work in this space. I do think it's safe to say that the words tech and compliance in the same sentence it's relatively new that we're saying that, but which is very different from finance and compliance or healthcare and compliance. But I think that's why it's important to understand that if you want to work in the tech industry with an emphasis on compliance, the number one thing that I would advise people to make sure that they do is to understand the culture of the company that you are working in and how people in the company work so that you can meet them where they are. So I already said this, but tech moves incredibly fast. Compliance can be known for being a roadblock, but it doesn't have to be, right? I mean, tech speak and compliance speak will feel like different languages. So when you're working as a compliance professional with people who are tech, you just need to find the common language and you need to become expert in what they do in order to help them. So learning more about the products, learning about the technology that you support is going to help you as a compliance specialist better identify risks and find the right way to mitigate them.
Yeah, and so the other thing that I think is so important about that, and I wanted to just pause and mention it, is that you need to know from them what they see as the largest risks as well, from an ethics standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, because then you can bridge a gap by not just speaking their language, but understanding what their concerns are, because those may end up falling into compliance, and you may actually be able to help solve some other problems without realizing it by doing that and flipping it around that way. I think it is. I always talk about we all need to speak sometimes we need to speak the same language. It's not the language that you speak at home. It's how do you speak, all understand what you're doing with a product. Like that all has its own company code or language.
I could not agree with that more. And that really relates to my number one piece of advice that I give anybody who asks for career advice or advice on advancing in their career. And it really is quite simple. It's just keep learning. I really think if you approach your job with a growth mindset and specifically being willing to change how you think, that will make you more resilient to what is truly a constantly changing environment that we're in right now, and that will help you succeed. I think it's interesting because often people feel like in order to prove themselves, in order to advance, they need to have confidence, they need to come across as experts. And while that's important, when I think about my own career journey and what's really helped me, it's when I've been willing to be vulnerable and open up and ask a lot of questions, learn new things, and embrace change. Because like you said, it's sometimes there are things that you don't see because you have blind spots. And if you're open to learning from other people, it will help you get better and collectively end up with better outcomes for everyone. So I think just having a growth mindset and being willing to learn new things it's important to everybody, but it's particularly important when you're talking about applying compliance in the tech space.
Yeah. Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for coming in and spending some time with me today. I'm so excited to have you part of the podcast. So on behalf of the Great Women in Compliance podcast, have a wonderful day and thank you again.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.